Hello and welcome to this Trash to Track. In this episode we're going to be looking at this Bachmann small prairie locomotive that I've had sitting in the overhaul queue for about 18 months, 2 years now. And I thought it was high time we got it going, so it looks in a bit of a mess. It's covered in hair and fluff, one of the steps is loose, and it's also got a good coating of dust. The wheels are covered in crud as well, so let's give it a battery test and see if we can get any life out of this. And it does spark into life initially, but it's very intermittent. There is quite the build-up of dirt and crud on the wheels, so we're going to have to take this apart, give it a thorough clean-up, and I'm also going to fit a DCC decoder to it so that I can run it on the preserved line in the garden. Putting the battery direct to the wheels, you do have to wobble it a bit to get it going, so that's either a very dirty connection on the pickup or a loose connection inside the body somewhere. So to take one of these models apart, there are two screws, one underneath the bunker and one underneath the smoke box. There's a lot of hair wrapped around this rear pony truck, so I'm going to have to sort that out. So using a small Phillips screwdriver, we just remove the two screws, one at the front and one at the rear. And I found it easier to loosen the front pony truck as well to get access. And then the body lifts up, revealing a very simple setup of a motor. No DCC socket, because this model obviously predates DCC. That wire there has been caught between the motor and the body shell and is actually frayed, showing bare wire. So that could also be a source of non-running. It could have been shorting out against the motor. But there is room in there for a decoder. There's a gap in the smoke box weight, so we're going to try and get a decoder that fits in there. I'm going to unscrew and remove this excuse of a PCB here and just snip the wires off. I'm not going to need this. I'm going to hardwire a decoder into here. So just getting my snips, I snip all the wires off, and then this PCB or whatever it's called can go into the bin. And that leaves a very simple DCC fitment, the two wires to the motor, which I do end up unsoldering because I'll solder the decoder wires direct to those terminals, and the two wires from the pickups. And also by cutting this allows me to remove the keeper plate. I'm also going to pop the motor out of its cradle there, just so I can have a look round and make sure there's no fluff and hair wrapped around the bearings. The coils look okay, and to be honest, inside the model there's very little in the way of dirt. Now, turning my attention to these pony wheels, this is the one with this hair wrapped around it. In fact, there's several. So this is obviously seen past service on a carpet, I would imagine, or with children. And I think if you remember, a couple of years ago, I actually bought this off eBay and did an eBay unboxing on it. That's how long it's been waiting for overhaul. So this hair is really matted around this axle. And I try and unwind it, but I get nowhere. So I resort to getting a scalpel and just cutting it off. Just cutting through the hair there and the dust. And eventually the axle is now foreign object free, and I can turn my attention to getting this cleaned up. I take the wheel out the front pony, but this has only got dust on it, no hairs or anything wrapped around this one, thank goodness. And now they're off their pony holders, or the wheel holders on the pony truck. I give these pony wheels a clean with a cotton bud of methylated spirits to remove any old track dirt off them. And now I'm going to turn my attention to the actual chassis, which initially I'll give a dust down with an old paintbrush, as there is a lot of dust and fibres all over this model. It was partly like this when I bought it, and partly from being in storage waiting for this episode. And now I've snipped those wires, I can remove the base keeper plate here by undoing all the remaining screws. And the pickups are riveted to this, so it all comes off in one. And yeah, those pickups are absolutely filthy. They're coated in black grime and fluff, so they'll need a thorough cleanup. No bearings on the model, and to my surprise, it is surprisingly dry in here. There's very little in the way of old lubrication, very little in the way of sticky gunky grease. It's very dry, if only a little bit dusty and a bit grotty, but I was expecting it to be really oily like some of these older Bachmann locos can be. So I'm going to give the axles and the chassis here a thorough clean up with a cotton bud and meths to remove any remnants of the lubrication that used to be there. And then I'm going to give those pickups a thorough clean. Now these were really dirty. You can see there on that cotton bud, the dirt on there was just coming off. Look at it, it's horrible stuff. It's like fluff and congealed black carbon. So I'm going to give these a thorough clean up as well with the cotton bud and mess. Give them a clean, and then might even polish that brass part with the fiberglass pencil just to make sure it is absolutely as clean as it can be. Now using my pin dropper, I'm going to put some oil onto the axles, because as I said, there was no way in the lubrication, nothing in the way of lubrication on this model. So I'm going to re-lubricate the axles, and then I can refit the base keeper plate now that the pickups have been thoroughly cleaned, and then reattach all those screws that we took out earlier on. There's about 4 screws, I think, if I remember rightly from this, and that's a bit overkill just to hold the base plate on. So I'm now going to put the front pony wheels back on as well that I removed earlier. These are held in place with a screw with a large head just to keep the pony wheels in place. So these were put back on, making sure that the brass spring pieces were the correct way round. And once those are back on, I can clip the wheels back into place. Now both wheels are exactly the same diameter, so it doesn't matter which goes in which. And I also add a small amount of oil to these just to give them a bit of lubrication, as the metal just sits in a plastic clip and can wear. You know, if the model has a lot of use, it can wear. So just to aid in running, I'm just going to lubricate it ever so slightly. On the subject of lubrication, a bit of Lebel 106 grease onto the motor worm, or the gear that connects to the motor worm, and then moving the chassis back and forward, it spreads the lubrication through the drivetrain. I'm also going to put a small amount of oil on the pinions there, and also on the gear itself to help thin out that grease a little bit and help it spread further. And then I'm going to put the motor back in its cradle after I've pulled off the hair and fluff that had wrapped around the motor shaft there near the worm gear. That just clips back into place, and that's as it should be. I'm going to unsolder and get rid of these suppressors or capacitors. There's 3 on this model. I'm not sure why there's 3, but fitting a DCC decoder, these can interfere with it. So I'm going to remove them all. And the decoder has built-in suppression in the actual decoder, so I don't need these on this model. But having 3 on here, that really is, in my opinion, that is overkill for such a small loco and a smallish motor. So when I've done that, I also desolder those wires off the motor, as the motor wires from the decoder will be soldered straight onto the brass tabs there. So talking to the decoder, I've got the harness here, and as I said, the orange and grey wires are soldered to the motor terminals. I don't need those long lengths of wire because it is only a short loco. The decoder will fit inside the smoke box without the need for super long wires. So orange and grey wires to the motor tabs, and red and black to the track pickups. The track pickups that are sticking up through the chassis there have had their ends stripped and tinned. It's a case of just touching them with the soldering iron to connect them, and then I'm going to put some heat shrink, which I've already put onto the wire there. I'm going to pull the heat shrink over and shrink that down with the heat of the soldering iron. So that's all I need to do. There you go, look, the heat from the soldering iron will shrink that heat shrink round and insulate that bare piece of wire. So that's the decoder harness in place. Obviously no lights or anything on this model, so that was relatively simple to do. And then the decoder is plugged in to the harness, and doing it this way, the soldering iron and any heat is kept away from the actual decoder to prevent any damage. And the stay alive wires there, they're just wrapped around the decoder because I'm not actually going to fit a stay alive to this model. So just testing it with the battery, the wheels are turning, it's working, so that means the decoder is wired up correctly. Turning my attention to the body shell, this just needs a good dusting over. It's very dirty and dusty from being in store. So using my paintbrush, I just work it around, getting all the nooks and crannies and crevices, and remove all the dust and cobwebs from this model. And then once that's done, I just get a small amount of Loctite super glue on a pin, and then I'm going to just put that into the gaps and then hold the loose cab steps in place until the glue sets. So I've got a bit on there. In fact, in the video here, it looks like I've got a lot of glue on there, but in fact there's very little. It's just there's a build-up of dried super glue on the end of the pin. So once that's in the gap, I just press and hold the footsteps in place, and I'll set that aside to dry. And once it's dry, we can start reassembling the model. Now the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to put a little bit of grease on the motor worm itself, because again that was cleaned and there's nothing on there. And just turning the motor with my finger, that will spread that onto the worm gear and onto the drivetrain. So that is properly lubricated now, ready for service. And now that's all done, I make sure the wires are in the correct place, and the decoder can be slipped inside the gap inside that weight in the smoke box. Push the wires in and the body sits back on the chassis. Very nice. And the two screws we took out at the start that released the chassis from the body are replaced. And now that that's done and I know everything's working, the chassis is appended, or the model is appended in my cradle, and I'm going to polish the driving wheels up. First with a fiberglass pencil, doing the wheel treads and the wheel backs. And then a final polish up with a cotton bud and meths. And you can see there on that cotton bud there is some dirt coming off it, so at least you know now all the wheels and pickups and wheel treads are clean. And the last bit to go on is the brake rigging, which I had to remove earlier to get access to the screws to remove that base keeper plate on the chassis there. And as with all models, this just fits in the tiny pegs fit in the hoops on the brake shoes, and this is just clipped and held in place with those tiny clips. So now everything's been reassembled, thoroughly cleaned. We're going to give it a new battery test now, and hopefully the model will work. And there you go, running straight off the bat, no problems. A lot different to the hesitant model we started with that was covered in hair, dust and fluff. So that's this rebuild complete. And for a model of its age, it really does hold its own against more modern offerings. And I really do like the look of these stocky little Great Western tank engines. So now it's all been rebuilt, it's thoroughly working and digital fitted. I'm going to have it running and put it through its paces in the garden. If you've got an engine you'd like to see featured on a future episode of Trash to Track, or if you need anything repaired in general, email me at dansmodelhours@gmail.com. We'll have a look at getting it sent over, and who knows, it may even feature in an episode all of its own. So I'm going to leave you now with some shots of this small prairie tank running around the garden. First of all on a branch line passenger rake, and then working a freight train back into the main station. Thank you for watching Trash to Track again. Please like, share and subscribe, and I will catch you all in the next video. Bye for now.